What's up everyone, Alex Corey here with CultivatedChange.com. I just got done doing another brief run. I think that's going to be the standard from now on. Is I tend to do most of my podcasting now when I'm out walking or jogging, just because that's the only real time to myself I have. And usually, occasionally, at least once a week, there's a fantastic podcast or video or some information put out by someone tuned into the metabolic field or the microbiome field, or just fitness and health and well-being in general. And that's when I get most invigorated, reinvigorated, and just it sets me on fire, like my last microbiome video, which I'll put here. This one was done by Mike Mutzel at High Intensity Health. Fantastic channel. I encourage you to check it out. Basically, at least 3 or 4 times a week delves into the most recent metabolic papers, and this one is on the difference in just manipulating one variable, and that's time. So we're going over the power of time-restricted feeding on health and metabolic markers in general. In the podcast, he was reviewing the longest intermittent fasting or time-restricted feeding study that we have, which is a year. I was in the Journal of Medicine and Science and Sports and Exercise, I believe. I'll give you a quick rundown because I don't remember all the details because I just got done running, but I remember enough of the key points, and then I will just allude to or show you specific segments of the podcast as needed. But just my enthusiasm for this is outstanding because every time I'm listening to a podcast, I expect small changes. So I expect changing one variable, like the time or the time of day you eat, to have, minor changes on something such as metabolic markers or something as profound as that. But some of the studies coming out have huge impacts. So there were 2 main groups in the study, about 10 people per group, and they just split them up. This was all men, so take that with a grain of salt. So training intervals and hormones are going to be a little different, obviously, between groups of men and women, but 2 different groups, 10 people in each group, if I remember, and everyone had been resistance training for at least 5 years, so there are no newbie metabolic changes, no massive swings in fat reduction and muscle gain, things like that you get when you just start resistance training. So this was a group of people who had already been resistance training for at least 5 years, and basically the only thing they were changing in this was your feeding window. So they were seeing if a 16-hour fasting window and an 8-hour feeding window was any different than a normal feeding window.
Study. A time-restricted feeding group was instructed to eat 3 meals at daily meals between 1 p.m., 4 p.m., and 8 p.m. And the normal diet, which we'll refer to henceforth as normal diet, was instructed to eat 3 meals daily at 8 a.m., 1 p.m., and 8 p.m. In essence, the study was designed to test the long-term effect of a 16-hour fast versus a 12-hour fast.
And it was nutrition, they had a nutritionist checking on them. So they adjusted all the factors. So it wasn't an epidemiological study. It wasn't an observational study, which is why it's fascinating. It's actually clinical. They weren't in a metabolic ward, so they did control calorie consumption. They made sure that each of the groups was having the same amount of calories. They did spread, I believe, the macronutrient distributions out. So each group was not eating the same percentage of their calories at each meal.
That the calorie distribution over the course of the study was a little bit different in the time-restricted feeding arm versus the normal diet arm. So in the TRF arm, 40% of the energy was in their breakfast at 1 p.m. About 25% of their daily calories was consumed at their lunchtime, which was around 4, and then 35% of their calories was consumed at dinner. So slightly different in the normal diet arm, but similar in the sense that the bulk of the calories was actually consumed around the middle part of the day, which is incidentally from a circadian rhythm standpoint when the gut is most active.
They didn't actually check if these people were metabolically flexible already or fat adapted, anything like that, which would have made it way more interesting, in my opinion, but that's a whole different ballgame. So what they found was, at the end, just from that extra 4 hours of fasting, they did a strength test at the end both groups had increased strength, and they tested strength by 1 rep bench press and leg press, which is pretty standard strength test. So both increased strength. The downside, and this is something I've played with myself because I've been trying to put on some lean mass, was that the normal group, so the no change, 8 to 8, was increased their body weight by about 3% because they were resistance training. So you do tend to put on some extra pounds. They put on weight. They increased their cross-sectional mass, their cross-sectional area, so the circumference of their muscles in the arms and legs, which is where they tested, by, I think it was about 3%. So a small gain in cross-sectional circumference, which you would expect from eating a normal, controlled, good, clean diet with resistance training. However, the group that did time-restricted feeding lost about 3% of their total body mass, but, big but, they had an 18% reduction, if I'm remembering that correctly, in their visceral adipose tissue. So they lost
linked with a 3.36% reduction in overall body weight and an 18.8% reduction in visceral fat.
A ton of visceral fat. And that's visceral fats around your organs, the kind you don't want. So subcutaneous is right under the skin. Visceral fat is the fat that's padding your organs, and that's around your midsection. All in here. That's what you want to get rid of. So that's outstanding just from 4 hours of an increased fasting window. Just don't eat whenever you wake up in the morning if you can. So they did, the normal group increased mass, the fasting group lost a little bit of mass, 3%, and they lost in their arms and legs. So this is what I've been dealing with, is all of the benefits of fasting generally come at the expense of growing, because you're either in a growth phase, which is going to favor insulin. Insulin is a growth hormone, technically, or you're in a breakdown phase. So if you're trying to lose body mass, fat particularly, you need to prioritize the catabolic stage. That's the breakdown, the liberation of fat from storage and freeing into the bloodstream and actual metabolism of fat, which is what most people are going for. So that's amazing. But if you're trying to gain lean mass like me, very hard to do that when you're only having 2 insulin spikes a day. So your body only has a chance to repair and rebuild muscle tissue twice a day, which is really hard. So that's why bodybuilders graze constantly. That's why every 3 hours usually you're eating high carbohydrate, high protein, just to constantly rebuild and regrow. However, that process does tend to spike a whole bunch of other what are now seen to be, well, all the growth factors, so IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor, all of those are the same pathways that metabolic disease and other diseases of the body need. So that is an inflammatory spike because you are shuttling all nutrients to anything that's growing. So if you have precancerous cells, or if you're at risk for anything, you don't necessarily want to give the pathogenic parts in your body that are growing extra nutrition. So this is why fasting is so powerful. But if you're being healthy anyway, not a big deal. Point being, if you're trying to gain weight, lean mass, put on some muscle, very hard to do that only eating twice a day. It can be done. You need to be very specific, and Thomas DeLauer has done a lot of research on this, and this is what I'm currently in the middle of, but this is a pretty overarching video. What they did find, the overwhelming benefits of that extra 4-hour window is, if I remember, basically everything that your doctor would want to happen and that you would want to happen went down. So their insulin levels went down by like 20% or something stupid like that in the intermittent fasting group. So in the time restricted feeding group, their insulin levels went down by 20%. Their triglycerides went down somewhere between, I think it was 8 and 20%. Their high density lipoprotein, their HDL went up. Their LDL, bad protein, and that's a whole nother topic, went down. So even the most mainstream or cookie cutter doctor would absolutely love those effects.
At the end of the study, HDL increased by 15.39%, glucose, insulin, and triglycerides dropped respectively by 9%, 28%, and 20%. So again, glucose dropped by 9%, insulin dropped by 28%. That's pretty significant if you think about that. So if you're fasting insulin with say 10 or 12, you're cutting that down into 7, 8, 9, in that ballpark, which, that's a big swing in insulin. So that's and again, these people weren't doing any prolonged fasting or things like that.
And what's even more powerful is they found all of their chronic inflammatory markers, so their innate immune system markers, things that are expensive to test. So they did not test C-reactive protein in this, which is usually the proxy marker that is used for smoldering low-level inflammation. Didn't test that, but they tested a lot of the interleukins, which are inflammatory cytokines, and other markers of metabolic smoldering, chronic stress, and immune system activation went down significantly.
Even more, markers of chronic inflammation were significantly reduced in the TRF group versus the normal feeding group. So some of these names may not mean a whole lot to you because, chronic inflammation, you're like, well, what is interleukin 6 or interleukin 1 beta or TNF alpha? Well, just understand that these are byproducts of innate immune system activation. These innate immune system activation is linked with chronic inflammation.
So just that extra 4-hour window allows for a cooling process, if you will. So it quenches that low-level fire your body is always trying to put out just from everyday living, from digesting. Digesting is actually kind of a stressful process on your body, so it's not great to be constantly spiking your insulin. Insulin sensitivity went up, so all of the right metabolic markers happened with the time-restricted feeding group, and in contrast, the normal group had no change. So they gained weight, and they had no change in their metabolic markers. Now, if you have great metabolic markers anyway, so if you don't have smoldering inflammation because your lifestyle is on point, your diet's already on point, no big deal. But if you are someone who is, potentially at risk or has family history of chronic disease, or is just worried about all of the maladies and pathogenic things that can happen to you as a result of having chronic inflammation or high insulin, which is, I would say, chronic inflammation, constant blood glucose and triglycerides in your bloodstream, high levels of those, anything that would put you at a risk for when you go see your doctor once a year and they see that you have high either fasting blood sugar or high hemoglobin A1C, which is a measure of the sugars bound to your specific protein that's used to carry oxygen in your blood, the things that they would check for. All of those went down with the time-restricted feeding group. Now, if you're on point, don't worry about it, but this is why I am tending towards 2 meals a day, high protein, moderate fat, low carb, just because the benefits of fasting are ridiculous. Just 4 hours. That is very doable for most people, as Mike Mutzel in the video pointed out. Most people, and it does take a little time to get there, but if your dinner is right, and your lifestyle is correct, you're not under constant stress, and your cortisol is not always elevated, and your body's not screaming for a quick dose of glucose because you're always under duress and that fight or flight mechanism is kicking in. If you're not in that state, fasting is doable for a lot of people. You don't need to start with a 16-hour fast. You can start with a 12-hour, which is what these guys are doing, and just see how long you can go. And then keep seeing how long you can go. Hey everyone, I have an offer for you. Do you have a healthy habit that you've been meaning to implement in your life, but you either haven't had the resources, you don't know where to start, don't have enough information, or you just haven't actually figured out where to implement it in your actual week? That's what I do. And as a gift for following me and a preparation for sitting for my board exams next year for the National Council on Health and Wellness Coaches, I need a ton of practice. So I'm extending a free 20 to 30 minute coaching session for any one of you. The link will be down below. I need a little context about what exact habit you'd like to implement. I'll have a link to my calendar right below that. Just submit that and I will reach out. This can be anything from nutrition, cutting the crap out of your diet, implementing or resuming a fitness routine, sleep and recovery, getting outside more, getting a little more movement in, building more social connection, anything that touches around the content that's been on my channel thus forth. And as a thank you, I will be having a substantial discount on any of the longer term health coaching programs I offer. See the link below. And every week you might get another hour out of that, as long as you have a decent amount of protein and fat in your nightly meal, and you are not constantly feeding on high dose of carbohydrates. You're not constantly spiking insulin. Remember, one of the prerequisites for fat metabolism is plenty of oxygen. So aerobic respiration, you need plenty of oxygen. You can't be under a high amount of duress. This is why high intensity exercise tends to favor more carbohydrate. You cannot have a super high cortisol level, because cortisol will spur the body to dump quick energy in the form of liberated glycogen into the bloodstream, so you can have some glucose. So you need that fight or flight kick to get quick energy into the cell. Fat takes a little longer to metabolize. So your insulin cannot be high. If your insulin is high, it's a signal to your body that food just came in and there is no need to liberate and burn and metabolize fat. Fat is your survival mechanism. So if you just ate, there's absolutely no reason for your body to liberate the fat for you to burn, because it considers that a precious resource. So if you're trying to lose fat, all of those things, so low stress as low as you can, low insulin, which means tend towards a lower carbohydrate diet. Protein and fat spike insulin to a much lower degree, just because the storage mechanisms are a little different and the metabolic conditions are a little different. It's such empowering information because it's so attainable for most people. If you put the plan in place to do, just even to test that, just to run an experiment. They did it for a year and they didn't lose that much muscle mass, and then all of the benefits you get. So I've been doing that for about 3 to 6 months, and I mean, just from lack of hunger alone, time-restricted feeding is wonderful, just because your body becomes better at utilizing fat. And even if you're skinny like me, you still have a good amount of fat. If you're 10% body fat and you weigh 160 pounds like I do, that's 16 pounds of fat. That's a lot of calories. So is that 3,500 calories, 3,000 calories per pound of fat? That's a lot of days of calories. So even if you're real low body fat, you still have a lot to work off of. I'll stop my rant, but more information like that's coming out, and it's so powerful because these are such small changes. Now that's just 4 hours and they only changed one thing. Imagine if they did a fat adapted person already with high intensity exercise and it wasn't straight. They didn't tell them what to do resistance training. Imagine if it was curated training with a personal trainer and they measured their intensity and all of that, varied cardio. Like, you did everything that most people would do instead of just telling someone to go to the gym. The only thing they were controlling was their nutrition. Imagine if they controlled any other variable. And the one thing that would be interesting to see, and Mike Mutzel points this out, is that's pretty late at night to eat, even by my standards.
Do what's best for you and figure out the feeding window that works with your lifestyle, with your work patterns, with your kids' feeding and everything like that. What I think would be interesting is actually comparing, an early time restricted feeding to the normal diet. The normal diet was, again, 8 to 8. But if you were to look at, say, 8 to 4, what would that look like? So compare the normal diet and the same window compression, 16-hour fast, but having food earlier in the day, what would that have done?
Most of the time, and I find this to be easier if you're thinking about doing time-restricted eating or just a compressed feeding window, is it's really easy. It's easier for me to eat late or earlier in the evening or later in the afternoon. So somewhere between 4 and 6 o'clock, maybe right when you get out of work, and that's usually when I'm hungry. Mainly because you have quite a bit of time to digest and have a completely empty stomach by the time, or mostly empty stomach by the time you go to bed. So your sleep tends to be a little bit better and your recovery tends to be a little bit better. And I can pack in more calories, which will set me up for being able to go longer in the morning. So instead of doing like an 8 p.m. feeding time and then 1 o'clock or noon the next day, I find mine works better if I do like 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening and then break it at 10 in the morning. So that's the sweet spot for me. Everyone's metabolism is different, obviously, but that also falls in line with the circadian rhythm a little more. So you are most insulin sensitive in the morning, just because that's when your body, that's when your cortisol is the highest. because cortisol is used to wake you up. So when you wake up, your cortisol is the highest and your insulin levels, or your cells are very insulin sensitive because they are expecting food. So if you're going to eat a higher carbohydrate meal, morning is usually better unless you're trying to work on other specific metabolic processes, such as incur mitochondrial biogenesis, make more mitochondria in your cells to be able to burn more fat. That's a whole nother topic. So if they changed the study and they did an earlier eating window that would be more in line with circadian rhythm, that would be interesting to see if it made even more of an impact, or maybe some of the metabolic markers for the normal group, if they shifted their eating and had a longer window in the evening, might have changed a little bit. But hopefully they'll continue to run more interesting studies. Just wanted to share my enthusiasm and tell you that all things are possible through nutrition. Basically, between, obviously all things is an overstatement, but between nutrition and exercise, you can have dramatic effect, 20% reductions in some metabolic inflammatory markers. If you were pre-diabetic, 20% reduction in any one of those, in HbA1c, in insulin, in blood glucose, 20% is no longer pre-diabetic. Just from that, just from tweaking one variable of time. I'll stop ranting. Thanks for watching the video, guys. Please like and subscribe to the channel. Just let me know. And if you like these types of digestible, study-based review that I find interesting, let me know. Until next time.